time, I have become a certified information privacy professional, both in US and EU law. I have written a paper that was presented in an adversarial hearing in ICANN at ICANN in Marrakesh. I've given this talk 7 or 8 times here in the local area, and I'm preparing to give this talk in Berlin in about 3 weeks to about 800 pharmaceutical attorneys from all over the world. And I say that not entirely to tout my own resume. It's my way of understanding how quickly this area of law has grown and how exponential the rate of growing is increasing. The rate of growth is increasing as we go through. So in January of last year, GDPR wasn't even a law yet. We have now seen laws spring up all over the world, and we are starting to see a lot of discussion about privacy in the United States, and California has gotten serious, and we're going to see some major changes in January of this year. And I think if you watch the headline news, it's not terribly surprising. Privacy has become a mainstream issue again in the United States and everywhere. We have seen breaches weekly. We had Cambridge Analytica. We had the NSA scandal. And I think consumers are becoming more aware of how much they don't know about, and everyone in this room is probably included, about how much we don't know about what data about us is out there, who has it, what they're doing with it, who they're sharing it with. And so this conversation that's been going on at the legislative level is a lot about giving consumers back some of that knowledge and some of that control. There might be some questions in the room about why it is that you need to come to a talk about a law that came out in Europe last year, and why you need to be listening to a talk about a law that's coming into California and isn't going to even be in effect for another 4 months or so. But I think what I am going to try to do today is talk not just about legal compliance, but kind of show you some of the opportunities for businesses that are presenting themselves in these conversations. Getting control of and having good data governance practices and being able to communicate with consumers about what you have on them, what you're doing with it, how you're protecting it, and who you're issue for businesses. It's going to be a reputation management issue, and it's going to become a value add. So I think that beyond mere legal compliance, this is something that is going to be needs to be more and more instilled in the culture from the very beginning, from the very first import of consumer data into a database, that respect for understanding and respect for the data source and understanding that that's an important part of who we are as humans, and treating it with respect and keeping track of where it's gone so that you can communicate that to consumers. Well, point it up. Point it that way. There we go. So thanks. So as I said, we have seen data breach headlines every week. It turns out it's actually been more than every week this year. I was going to try to put on the slide all of the data breaches that have made the headlines this year. I couldn't possibly begin to fit them all on one slide. So I kind of pulled out the headlines. So Blur was the first one that came out early January this year. Almost 2.5 million users were affected. I don't know if anybody remembers this one, saw anything about it, knows who Blur was or is. They were a password management company. They had one job. Town of Salem video game, if anyone was playing that, 7.5 million users. Discountmugs.com had their credit card processor skimmed. Benefit Mall HR services, so all of the sensitive and personal information about employees for companies all over the country. Capital One hit like a third of us because they were holding on to records from 10 years ago that they didn't need. Poshmark hit probably a third of the women in America last week. There have been 86 others, and we just started the 4th quarter of the year. So you can begin to understand why fatigue is setting in for consumers, and it's becoming harder and harder for them to trust when their information goes out. And it's not just companies that this has been a problem with. This is a screenshot that I took from the news last week of the protesters in Hong Kong holding umbrellas over their heads to block out the facial recognition cameras and knocking down the facial recognition cameras on the streets of Hong Kong. Among other things that the Hong Kong protesters are protesting, one of them is the overreach of invasion of privacy being imposed on them by the Chinese government. We in America have had conversations about what the government is doing with our information. With the NSA scandal and everything we learned from Edward Snowden a few years ago, we're familiar with this as well. So this is a problem not only at the private level, but at the public level. And it kind of makes you want to move there, right? So unfortunately, moving on to a mountain in North Carolina is probably not going to solve the problem. It's harder and harder to get off the grid these days. We will soldier forward, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a very brief history. I'm not going to get too much into the legalese here. I don't have a lot of time, and I want to give you all as many practical tips as I can. So brief history of privacy laws across the world. We got our first one in 1970 in the region of Hesse, Germany. There are a lot of reasons why you can imagine why a post-World War II Germany might be the first place that we saw a privacy law, but I think the timing is more about computers than it is about anything political. So computers started to be used in businesses in a way that allowed information to move from bankers' boxes and file vaults to storage where they could store a lot more of it, and they could manipulate it in ways that wasn't available to them before. And so we saw our first consumer privacy law in 1970. The field was pretty quiet until 1995 with the EU Directive on Data Protection. And the obvious thing that happened between 1970 and 1995 was the internet, which took what computers were able to do with information and exploded it. Everyone knows that. So in 1995, the EU government was primarily concerned with the idea that over the internet, information about consumers could be moved very quickly to anywhere in the world. And they wanted to make sure that at least within the EU, they could offer some sort of harmonization of the laws so that a German citizen's information that started out in Germany would be equally protected in Italy or in Greece as it was at home. That was the initial push for the Data Protection Directive. It did that reasonably well. Directives in the EU are really only frameworks. The member states can implement their own customized legislation, and so the devil is in the details. Also, the 1995 directive made business really hard in Europe because it had a reporting requirement. So businesses had to report to the data protection authorities in their country what their data processing methods were, what kind of information they were collecting, who they were sharing it with. And so it was a real drag on the ability to effectively do business. Meanwhile, in the United States, we definitely hit a low point in our concern about privacy in 2001 after the September 11th attacks. It started to come back here. Legislatively in the United States, we have always been in what we call a patchwork. We have specific federal laws over sensitive information, health, money, and kids. Anything outside of that, it's essentially the Wild West. But businesses can do whatever they want with your information, at least as of today, as long as they tell you the truth about what they're doing about the information. And every state has different laws, so we're in a real patchwork. But the overall national conversation certainly took off after the NSA disclosures and everything we learned about government mass surveillance. And then in the meantime in Europe, they were revising the Data Protection Directive into what has now become the GDPR. And the GDPR, one of the things that it really tries to do is make business easier, believe it or not, with all the compliance obligations that it includes. But it jettisoned the reporting requirement, and its mission statements. Oops, actually I've got an extra slide in between. I'll get to the mission statement here in a second. But its mission statement is to promote the free flow of information, but also to respect the data subject's rights. So it's really not about trying to stop people from processing information. This is primarily the EU and the US. And those are the ones we will talk about today. The European Union, the United States, specifically California, which I'm going to scare you like, over and over again in this presentation because I'm going to mention it ominously like 10 times before I actually tell you what it says. Sorry. But also Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Nigeria, Australia, Thailand all have implemented GDPR-like legislation. So as the world becomes smaller and as the big data sets start touching consumers from all over the world, all of these laws are going to come into play. So we will start with the GDPR. There was a great mural up in Dover, England, until very recently. It was actually a Banksy mural of a guy whitewashing out one of the stars because of Brexit, but they took it, they washed it or painted over it recently. I was very sad. Anyway, so the GDPR 2018, it is for the protection of natural persons with regard to the processing of personal data and the free movement of such data. And there's a couple of things going on in that sort of mission statement or that recital. One is that it affects natural persons. This means human beings and not individual human beings and not businesses, although the definition of personal information is exceedingly broad and includes their business information. So where they work, their contact information there, their business email, et cetera. Also, only alive persons, not dead ones. But the threshold for eligibility for subjectability to the GDPR is low. So if you're touching the information of one person in the EU, one natural person in the EU, the GDPR applies. There are certainly some questions to be asked about how something like that can be enforced in the United States, but that's sort of a different conversation. We're assuming the worst here today. So natural persons with regard to the processing of their personal data. Processing is also defined very broadly. It's any touch, it's collection, it's analysis, it's certainly sale or sharing, it's storing. Any sort of touch of a person's data will qualify as processing. But it's that data and allowing it to cross borders and allowing companies to share it so long as they are in compliance with the obligations. And normally I do about a 90-minute presentation just on the obligations of the GDPR, but I have sunk this way down for you guys. So we're going to cover 4 of the highlights on the GDPR. We're going to talk about what the rules are around data processing. And if you are familiar with sort of the principles of data security, some of this is going to sound familiar. So hopefully some of this won't be a major change for the businesses that you're in now. Sorry, I keep doing that. Data subjects have rights. There's a whole bundle of rights that is fairly new in terms of our consideration about how we have to account to consumers going forward. The GDPR divides obligations between data controllers and data processors, and we'll talk about who those 2 parties are. And then we will talk ad nauseum about record keeping and how very, very, very important it is. So, data processing has to be lawful. It has to be done for a specified, explicit, and legitimate purpose. I will make these slides available however you all need them, so you don't have to worry about writing it all down. The operative term there really is specified and explicit. So what this means is that the purpose has to be made in writing and made available to the consumers so they know what the purpose is. It has to be limited to what is necessary. When we signed up with Attendify for the app for this conference yesterday, they asked for our email address, which we get, but they also asked for our first and last name. I don't know why they needed that. Accurate and kept up to date, so it must be maintained. It has to be erased after storage is no longer necessary, and there's a lot of room for discussion over what no longer necessary means. And it has to be kept secure. So what does lawful mean? Oh, sorry, one more. And it has to be, and you are subject to accountability for all processing done, meaning that you have to be able to account both to data protection authorities, but also, more importantly, to the consumers about what you're doing with their information. Yeah? Can you let me get to that? Okay. It's in the presentation, I promise. I won't let you get away without not knowing that. But the answer is yes. The quick answer is the GDPR requires those notices to be clear and concise. Concise is a challenge because there's a lot of information they want in it. But we can't, a lot of lawyers have had to rewrite a lot of privacy policies in the last year, for sure. Okay. Now here we are, lawful. What does lawful mean? Lawful means there are 6 grounds under which you can process information. The first one is consent. That's easy. It's a good one because it's easily demonstrable. You can keep records of consumers who have given consent for the processing of their information. It's bad because it's fragile. Consent can be withdrawn. So it's not our favorite. Contract, that's my favorite. This one I love. As long as you are performing a contract or performing your side of a contract with a consumer, so it's a magazine subscription, it's software as a service, it's something for which they pay monthly, annually, whatever, and you're holding up your end of it, you can process their information to the extent necessary to perform that contract. That one's good. The next couple are not as important for the average US private business. Compliance with legal obligations is an interesting one and will play out in sort of interesting ways in the United States. So if we are, for example, in litigation and there are discovery requests, the first thing that happens in litigation is that your lawyer sends you a litigation hold letter, which means don't destroy anything because we might have to turn it over to the other side. So I can see where a company's obligation, say, to destroy information or to report it back may bump up against their litigation hold obligations. We'll see what happens there. But it's not going to be sort of an everyday kind of consent ground. Protection of the interests of a person. This means like their physical well-being. Like really, they're so not sort of their business interests. Performance of a task in the public interest, so national interest, security kinds of issues, and some research in the national interest. Again, not the day-to-day for most companies. And then the last one is the one that gets the most attention from private businesses, and that's the legitimate interest of the processor. This is not a catch-all exception that's going to, authorities will make sure of that. It does mean that if you can't fall into any of these other categories and you do have an interest in processing it, you can weigh that interest against the rights of the consumers. You can, particularly if you're processing sensitive information like health or information about kids, you can write out a data protection or a risk assessment of what the harm might be to those data subjects and how you can mitigate those risks. And if you can, in good faith, determine that your legitimate interest outweighs their rights, then the information can be processed under this ground. It better all be in writing. Because if someone comes and asks, you need to be able to show it. So it's certainly the one that's probably used most often, but again, we don't have a lot of guidance yet, unfortunately, from the EU data protection authorities or from any of the groups that were supposed to give us all the working papers that we're supposed to fill in all the gaps here about exactly when this applies and when it doesn't. Sooner or later, somebody's going to get hit with a giant fine. Yes?
Short example of that? I mean, that's a statement of that.
about what a legitimate interest might be.
What kind of argument can you make for that?
What's a good argument that I would be absolutely comfortable making if you know, the French Data Protection Authority came knocking and was asking about it? So if I have, well, certainly if you are processing consumers' information in order to understand which of your consumers are most profitable, for example, for the business, in order to understand how the business can better market or how the business might position itself to reach certain kinds of customers in a better way, in a way that it's being used internally, for example. If you're selling information or sharing it with third parties who are not just service providers, I would say that's going to be a tougher call. Is that, yeah. So this is how data processing can continue under the GDPR. Data subjects have rights. They have the right to know who is processing their information. This goes into how we're all rewriting these privacy policies and a lot of the information that we have to put into them now. And that includes downstream processors, so both your service providers, but also your buyers if you're in infonomics or data selling of any kind. They have the right to have cost-free access. You can't charge them for giving them the information that you have to give them, but you can get reimbursed if there are expenses. It just can't become a profit center. But they do have the right to actually access the information that you have on them. They have the right to have their information corrected to date, so that works out nicely. You've heard probably something about the right to be forgotten. Google's been facing this a bit in Europe. It's actually pretty limited under the GDPR. If their lawful basis was consent. Oh, that was the other thing I should have said. Marketing is expressly indicated in the GDPR as a legitimate interest. Direct marketing, so from B2C marketing is covered under legitimate interest. But they can withdraw that, your ability to do that under their right to be forgotten. They have the right to have their information ported to a third party. This can include a competitor. So that is one issue, particularly if your company's, one of their trade secrets is their customer list, for example. This could create some issues. When Mark Zuckerberg has been hailed up in front of Congress, one of the things that he's talked about in terms of acting like he's in favor of a federal privacy regime is that consumers should, sorry. Does it even work for them in here? I'm sorry. It's just, they're so easy. Okay? But one of the things he talks about is how, yes, first I thought, well, that's odd. And then I thought, well, who the hell is Facebook's competitor? Like, what difference does it make if we can port our information to somebody else when it's Facebook? Like, we can download it. They do give us the access. We can pull all of our information down from it, but who are we going to give it to? Anyway, so, but no, I mean, I do think that there's the possibility that it could be used as kind of a escape hatch if there's, other kinds of violations where, big tech can simply say, well, you can just give your information to somebody else and take it away from us, so it's fine. We don't have to be otherwise responsible in any way. And I think, when we're talking about where there's complete lack of competition, that's a problem. They do have a limited right to object altogether to the processing, but that's really only if the processing was unlawful in the first place. So again, GDPR is not about stopping information from being processed or being shared. It's far more about knowledge of the consumers and accountability from companies about how that information is being treated. So controllers and processors. As I said, I didn't know anything about GDPR January of last year, and I got a call from a client of mine who runs an e-commerce platform. And he said, hey, I got this data protection agreement from one of my clients who's a cheese shop in France. Can you read this? And I was like, let me call you back. And that sort of began my 6 months of eating, breathing, and sleeping this stuff. But so in that scenario, my client, who was here in the United States, is a data processor. Their cheese shop client in France is a data controller. The cheese shop is the front line. They're the ones who collect the information from the consumers. They're the ones who make the decisions about what information is going to be collected. They're the ones who make the decision about where it's going to go and who it's going to be shared with. The processors are the ones who do that processing on behalf of the controller. So my client was the e-commerce platform. They ran the credit card processing. They only use the information for that purpose. But under the GDPR, they have certain specific obligations to each other that get played out in these data protection agreements. So controllers are responsible for implementing the appropriate technical and organizational measures to implement data protection principles. And those are, pretty basic security. GDPR does not give us a lot of specifics about security principles. If you're ISO 2700, if you're HIPAA compliant, if you are implementing best standards, technical, physical, and administrative, responsible for implementing that kind of security in their own system, but also making sure that it's been implemented with the processors. And they do that in the form of these data protection agreements. And you're going to start to, or your companies are going to start to see more and more of these. And what a lot of companies who process, I know Google has one, several of this just sort of service platforms that have customers all over the world have just put one on their website and said, hey, here's our data protection agreement. If you need it, if you're a customer in Europe and you need to show it to a data protection authority somewhere so that we have one, here it is, you can have it. It's going to sort of become like business associate agreements. If you're in the healthcare field, they get thrown around all over the place. And I don't think they're going to be hugely adversarial. For one thing, the GDPR basically wrote these for us. There are standard contractual clauses, so companies are not going to have to spend millions of dollars with lawyers getting these things negotiated. But it does have, there's a couple of sort of highlight points. One is to make sure that the controllers are complying with the security protocols, the processors are complying with the security protocols of the controllers. And the other is that processors under the GDPR have a very short window to report breaches to their controllers. It's 72 hours. And that's from the breach, not from knowledge of the breach. It's the way it's written. So if there are a lot of reasons why having a written data breach response plan is a good idea. This is one of them, so that when it turns out that you really don't know about the breach until 6 weeks after it happened, or the intrusion until 6 weeks after it happened, and then it takes another 2 weeks to figure out whether or not they actually took anything, you can show the relevant authorities that you have a plan and that this wasn't just because somebody was asleep at the wheel. It's because that's how it works. But so U.S. companies are probably, a lot of you are going to be in the experience of being processors in this scenario, and sort of being obliged under these requirements. Finally, with the GDPR, notice record keeping, so important. So there is public notice that goes out in the privacy notice or the privacy policy, however you want to call that, and then there are internal records. The privacy notice has a bunch of you've got a bunch of responsibilities to put in there. It's basically what we're collecting, why we're collecting it, the legitimate bases under which we're processing it, special information if we're collecting information about kids, the categories of who we're sharing it with. So our third-party service providers who help with our email or do our marketing, for example. Specifically for EU companies anyway, if it's being transferred outside the United States, and then how long the company's policy is to keep the information. However, so this is what's required in the privacy notice. However, consumers have the right to know who you share the information with specifically, not just by category, but by identity. So that's a good thing to keep in the internal records. And then, again, your security and data protection measures. So, back in May of last year, you guys got hundreds upon hundreds of emails, right? We've changed our privacy policy. No reason. So this is what they were doing. They were rewriting it to make it not so legalese, to make it clear, and to put all the requirements from the GDPR into their policies. Questions on the GDPR? I'm going to move on to California here in a second. Yeah.
There's been any talk around, not just the data points themselves, but more of like the algorithms they're using in order to like record keeping requirements around those, or is that kind of well off into the future?
Record keeping around the algorithms. Yeah. You're beyond my knowledge right here, so. Not specifically. If there is some reason why the use of that particular algorithm would affect the rights of the consumer, I would, if not report it in the privacy notice, at least have it in the bundle of data that you're prepared to give out. Actually, one more on this, of course. All of the, yes, all the people who are not responsible for GDPR. So if you're anonymizing completely, like for real anonymizing, not just separating it out and then putting it back together later, then it's exempt. Public official documents are exempt. Employee data, so that means if you work for a European company, you don't have these rights vis-a-vis your boss, right? That's what that means. So again, if we come up against obligations of secrecy, and if you're in scientific or historical research, or if it's purely for statistical purposes, so pure aggregation, information about consumers by zip code, whatever. If it really is separated from their personally identifiable information, it can be done. Archiving, and then if you work for a church, which around here you're likely to, you're exempt from GDPR. So, okay, now I really am going to move on to California, because California is, oh man, Okay, so this is actually a great day to be doing this, because this is the last day that the tech companies have to get changes to this law implemented before, because the session ends on Friday. So the California Consumer Protection Act actually became law last July, but we've spent the last year or so making changes to it, because when it was signed by the governor, it was really bad. It had lots and lots of technical errors and typos and inconsistencies. And the reason, some real estate tycoon in San Francisco by the name of Alistair McTaggart was at a fancy party talking to a Google kid in a hoodie, and sort of talking about all the information that or how well Google seems to know us, basically. And the kid said, "Man, if you knew everything that we know about you, you'd be completely freaked out." And Alistair completely freaked out. So he gathered a whole bunch of privacy gurus together, and they wrote their own privacy legislation. And it was, I mean, if you're in the processing business, it was bad. Like, it was very, very, very consumer friendly, very draconian to businesses. And he took it to the California legislature in July of 2017, I think, and said, they started drafting it in July of 2017. He had it ready by July of 2018, took it to the governor and to the legislature and said, if y'all don't pass something that I can live with, I'm gonna take this to a referendum in November, and I'm gonna take it directly to the people, which is something that they do in California. And it's pretty unlikely that something that was giving consumers all kinds of rights about their information wasn't going to pass, right? So, so the legislature scrambled, and they, in about 2 months, they wrote this legislation, and it was a mess. So we've been fixing it, but at the same time, companies have been kind of pushing back on some of the requirements under it, and today is the last day that they can get those through, because once we get to Friday when the session ends, we'll actually know for sure what the legislation says, because it goes into effect in January, so now would be a good time to know. So the California bill would authorize a consumer to opt out of the sale of personal information by a business, and would prohibit the business from discriminating against the consumer for exercising this right. When we talk about what a privacy regime might look like, you hear a lot of the dichotomy between notice and choice. Whether consumers just need to know what's happening with their information, or whether they have some kind of choice or control over that information. GDPR is by and large a notice regime. California is a choice regime. So, as I said, the law will go into effect January 1st, 2020. There's this look-back period in the law where if there is some kind of a violation that's brought up, the Attorney General of California can say, what were you doing with, or how were you holding on to information and processing information? You need to know how they were processing information in 2019. It doesn't mean that the companies have to be scrambling to be compliant with what the CCPA says as of right now, but they have to be able to show in writing how it was that they were holding on to information. So if you don't have written security protocols, processing protocols, and identified employees who have access to this information, on a need-to-know basis, a data breach response plan, like, go talk to your bosses and get it now, because it's going to be important very soon. So it goes into effect in January, but what the rules actually are around compliance, we won't probably know until about July. So there's probably 6 or 7 months of breathing space before there are going to be any real compliance efforts that go on. The California Attorney General is not super excited about having to do this, so he may drag his feet a little bit, but it's coming. So who has to comply with the California law? So if you collect information on more than 50,000 California residents, households, or devices, and that number is counted cumulatively. So if you've got information on a consumer in California, you can assume that that consumer is not only a consumer but a household. And if you're getting that information online, then it's either through their phone or their computer or their iPad or whatever. So count each consumer twice plus however many devices. So figure somewhere between 10 and 15,000 actual human beings is going to hit this requirement under California. Also, if your company has more than $25 million in annual revenue, and that doesn't mean annual revenue from California, it means annual revenue overall. And then this slightly odd one, if more than half of your revenue comes from the selling of information, or from Californians' information, then it applies. Move on here. Yeah. No, this is an or. Yeah, sorry. So any one of these, and the California law applies. So rather than going through all the nuts and bolts of the California law, I am going to give you guys kind of the main differences between California and the GDPR. And really the one that matters more than anything. Come on. There we go. Okay. The definition of personal information, it's broad, just like the one under the GDPR is broad. It does both include IP addresses, things like that. The California one includes olfactory information. So that's what it says. Consumers have rights. Man, I'm trying to get to the good stuff, and now my clicker. Right, okay. So again, notice is required. What was collected, for what purpose, to whom it was shared, and for what purpose and to whom it was sold. And the definition of sale under the California law is very, very broad. So it's not just sale of information for money. It's any kind of valuable consideration. So it's going to include a lot of the sharing of information that goes on between companies. And it doesn't apply to the sharing of information to third-party service providers, but figuring out who your service provider is versus who's not a service provider and just sort of a regular old third party is tricky and a lot right now to try and limit how many of these things people are going to, or how many of their third parties are going to bring them under this compliance requirement, because a consumer can opt out. And the way that a consumer can opt out of the GDPR is that on January 1st, 2020, you're going to log into your Facebook page. If you live in California, maybe. Maybe they're going to do this across the United States. We'll see. If you live in California, you're going to log into your Facebook page, and there's going to be a button on the upper right-hand corner that says, "Do not sell my information." And you can click on it. How cool is that, right? But then Facebook has to not only put that button up there and tolerate this, but they have to be able to respond to it, right? I mean, they have to actually be able to implement your request and pull your data set out of whatever it is that they're sharing with, the next Cambridge Analytica. So that's coming. And not only can they not, or do they have to do this, but they can't say, well, if you don't let us sell your information, you can't use the service. They can't discriminate that way. What they can do, and we'll see whether or not this comes or not, is they can say, well, okay, everyone's going to pay $5 a month or whatever it is. And you can either pay $5 a month or you can give us your policy and it's not discrimination. That's one way they could handle this. Those rumors go around all the time that Facebook is going to have to start charging us. Is there anybody here who thinks it's worth $5 a month? Okay, yeah. So this is major. I mean, this is if your business is selling data, right? If you're in the business of monetizing data by selling it to third parties, I don't know what's going to happen to those businesses. I really don't. Because for one thing, the challenge is going to be, I mean, it's fine with Facebook, right? They're a B2C company. They're front-facing. Like, we see them. But what about all those downstream companies? I mean, we don't know the names of, probably 80% of the companies who have our information. Are we going to start getting notices in the mail about our ability to opt out of the sale of our information from companies we've never heard of? We might. Or at least if you live in California. But I think businesses are really going to have to start deciding whether or not they want to geofence this so that it's just Californians, or whether they want to just go ahead and bite the bullet and say, look, this is coming, it's going to move east, and so we're just going to go ahead and do it across the board. Another challenge that's going to come up with this is verifying whether or not a customer is a California resident, or whether or not they've somehow gotten around, if you're geofencing, gotten around it. So there are a lot of challenges and not a lot of time before this goes into effect. Yeah?
This sort of, I think, parallels with targeted marketing and that sort of thing?
So I think it's, at the end of the day, going to come down to whether or not you can reasonably identify a particular human being from that information. So yeah, this, I mean, if it's really and truly aggregated sets, I mean, we know it wasn't, like with Cambridge Analytica, for example. I mean, we know it wasn't. We know, you know, they had names and first names, last names, zip codes, whatever. If it's, you know, income level, you know, zip code, you know, number of trips to Target, what, you know, some along those lines, and it's truly aggregated, and you couldn't figure out who the person was from that, then I think you're going to be okay. I mean, that's really all of this is about, the ability of companies to know who we are as people. I'm giving you that answer at about 98% certainty. And part of the problem is that the way that the California law is drafted, every other law about personal information says information that can be used to reasonably identify a person, which includes, well, and I guess olfactory information could be used, I don't know. Again, California law was not clearly drafted, so a lot of this we're going to have to figure out. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, great. Yeah.
All of you are talking about, and good information, of course, that it is California. And at some point, can you forecast, like, because I feel like that California law is a very trial law. Trial means like everybody's watching it. And
For sure.
then it will just percolate and precipitate to all other states. You also mentioned like mostly we treat U.S. as a patchwork. So is there any indication that the federal system would come into play and they will say something like the GDPR, like European Union did that, and then that became, it would become more of a federal law?
Yeah. So, well, no, that's fine. This is actually a good time to do this. And I mean, again, you know, I said at the beginning, I mean, Europe seems like a long way away. California's on the other side of the country, but this is coming, for one thing. And for another thing, this is the kind of thing that's going to raise consumers' awareness about what rights they ought to have. So Washington State almost passed a GDPR-like, CCPA-like bill last year, and they ran out of time. Oregon was looking at it, so it's moving up the coast, and you know then it will move. Nevada passed one, and I'll talk about Nevada in just a second, but it got really watered down. So you know some states it sort of depends on the lobbying efforts and how much people are paying attention and those kinds of things. So with the state laws, it's coming. I mean, the great thing is it's going to be different in every state, right? Which is how it is now. Federally, have you met Congress? Like, I mean, they've held hearings about this. They've held numerous hearings about this over like 2 years, and I don't know how many times Zuckerberg's been pulled up in front of Congress, but there's no indication that this is going to happen, you know, anytime soon. And I mean, we've talked about it before, and it seems like now there's an appetite for it. You know, we might see something, you know, in the next administration, maybe. And the nice thing about this issue is that it's a pretty bipartisan issue, right? I mean, people even if you're on the extreme politically, you care about consumer privacy. For businesses can decide whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think at least having rules and having companies understand that privacy protection is going to become as important to their reputation and not just to their legal budget as you know any of the other you know social or political issues that consumers care about when they care about brands. It's going to you know raise the quality all across the board, and I think that's a good thing. And once it gets raised, then maybe you don't have to worry about compliance between California and Florida quite so much. Yeah.
This ability to opt out, is that per entity or one and done for every company? So can I opt out of Facebook but then opt in for Instagram?
Yes. Well, That's a good question, right? Because they're the same company. So that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they've gotten that granular. I mean, certainly it's a per company issue.
Is it a line item, sort of like, you're allowed to use it for marketing, but not for, issuing me coupons when I'm walking around a venue?
So it's a question of whether or not you can sell it. And again, the information or the definition of sale is broad. So the company can still use your information internally.
Any way it sees fit?
There are, yes, I mean, yes. There are still, there are notice requirements now, but we don't have nearly as much choice as consumers about what goes on inside Facebook as we do once it goes out Facebook's door.
And the other thing is, I didn't catch it in my notes, does this also apply to downstream vendors and downstream partners, or is it just the entity that you're dealing with, like Facebook?
So it does insofar as anyone who is selling information has to give consumers this opt-out right. So if it gets sold more than once, then that secondary and tertiary transactions fall under this. But the question is, how do they communicate that to consumers?
For example, like Cambridge Analytica. So I give my consent to Facebook, but then Facebook can then do whatever it wants. I don't have to then re-consent with Cambridge Analytica, right?
You would.
I would.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Right. Exactly. So you tell Facebook, or you don't click on the button with Facebook, right? Facebook sells your information to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge wants to sell it to, Ukraine Incorporated. Cambridge Analytica, under the California law, would have to get your consent in order to, or would have to give you the opportunity to opt out in order to do that. So, yes. So Facebook has to put a button, right? It's that, but all those other companies, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how. That's the problem. We don't know, right? That's exactly the problem. We don't, and that's the problem for these companies as well. I mean, nobody knows. I mean, nobody knows who they are. I mean, much less whether they have data on them. Or now all of a sudden we're gonna. I mean, I'm assuming if they're complying with the law, we're gonna get postcards in the mail because that's how they're gonna. I mean, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yes, I should have had a slide on that actually. The GDPR, the upper level fines are 4% of global revenue, or 20 million pounds or 20 million euros, per violation. So it's a lot. I mean, that's upper level though. I mean, that's not, I mean, the French Data Protection Authority fined Google 50 million euros. Which to Google is nothing, and nobody can screw up privacy like Google can, right? I mean, the complaint against Google was your privacy policies are all over the place. They're different from one product to another. They, interact with documents that aren't there, or they don't make any sense. It was just very, to the extent that GDPR says your privacy policy has to be clear and concise, Google failed ultimately. But I mean, literally nobody else can screw that up the way that Google can. So. Yeah, so the fines are coming, and they're big, but they're mostly targeting big companies right now, mostly. California, it's $750 per violation, but there's also, right now, there's a private right of action. So consumers can decide to just sue instead. Hold on just one second. I've got 2 minutes. I've got 2 more slides, and then I can, yeah, so. Other way, sorry. There goes 10 seconds of it. Okay, so a couple of other state laws to make you aware of the fact that, EU and California are not it. Vermont last year passed a law saying that if you're in the business of data brokering, so if you are not a consumer-facing company, if you're one of those, secondary companies or tertiary companies, and you're selling information, you don't have a direct relationship with the consumers, you have to register with the Vermont Secretary of State and pay a fee. So if your company is in that business and they haven't done it yet, have them come talk to me. Nevada, as I said, passed sort of a CCPA law, but it only applies to companies that are selling goods. And so it applies to Amazon, but not to Twitter. And it only applies if you don't have any security protocols. So it doesn't really apply. It does require that your privacy policy tells whether or not third parties can collect information from your website. But that's something I probably would have put in the privacy policy anyway. So there's that. And then Florida, this one has been around for a while. It's one more reason to have a data breach notice, which is that if it has to be in writing, and if there's a breach and the Florida Attorney General asks for your data breach response plan and you don't have one, it's like a $500,000 fine. So have a breach. What the heck are you supposed to do, right, with all of these laws? Create a concise privacy notice, have written internal policies. What's that, like the 6th time I've said that now? Keep good records. Comply with requests when they come in, or tell the data subjects why you can't. Educate your team. Make sure that this isn't just board level. Make sure that employees, the junior analysts, the marketing folks, everyone knows what the rules are around security. If the company uses two-factor authentication, make sure people are using two-factor authentication, that people aren't downloading WeatherBug onto their computers. Don't keep secrets. There was an article from David Fahrenholt at the Washington Post about credit card companies and what they're doing with, or not doing with consumers' transaction data. And the thing that was the most alarming about that article was how many companies refused to comment. Don't keep secrets. And whatever you put in your privacy notice, keep your promises. Please don't cut and paste a privacy notice from Amazon. You don't do it that way. Like, say what you mean in your privacy policy and keep your promises, and you guys should be okay. So, thanks. Yes? Oh. I cannot tell you off the top of my head what article that is defined in the GDPR, but if I get your email address, I can send it to you. Yes, nonprofits are also exempt from the CCPA, but businesses who are selling information to nonprofits are not. So, yeah, good. Thanks, guys.